As usual, thanks for joining this afternoon. For those of you that might not know me, my name's Kyle Miller. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Architecture, and I'll be partly hosting the event. So first, a note about the format. For those of you that have been here before in the other events of this series, you'll know that we'll have the lecture, and immediately after the talk has concluded, we'll go down to the atrium where you can grab snacks and a beverage and a seat, and then we'll have a more conversational event led by Professor Mark Linder, and you'll have a chance at that moment to ask questions. So, to introduce Paul. Paul Preissner is a professor of architecture at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and founder of Paul Preissner Architects, also based in Chicago. I'll start with just a couple of facts before moving into something that's hopefully a bit more substantive. Paul earned a Bachelor's of Science degree at UIUC in 1996 and a master's degree from Columbia University in 2000. During and after graduate school, Paul served as a designer in offices such as Eisenman Architects, Woods Zapata, and SOM, where he worked on a number of cultural projects and sports facilities. From 2003 to 2005, Paul taught at SciArc and afterward relocated to Chicago, where he started his own practice and began teaching at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Between now and then, Paul's also taught at a number of institutions: Nebraska, SciArc, Penn, and Columbia. And also here, where he's been a visiting critic now on 3 occasions. So his first stint was in 2014, again in 2018, and we're lucky to have Paul back now this fall. So Paul's talk will primarily focus on 2 recent projects. So I'll use the remainder of this introduction to maybe say something about what preceded those 2 projects. And as a refresher for myself, I rewatched the talk that Paul gave here in 2014 during his first time here as a visiting critic. During that time, Paul presented his work in a rather reflective manner, really depicting and retelling the story of the dramatic shift in his work around 2011, and also a larger shift in the discipline at that time that for a variety of reasons encouraged designers to move away from some of the more elegant and heroic forms that were enabled by digital modeling techniques and graphic algorithms, and moving instead towards an aesthetic sensibility and a set of formal qualities that could only be described as awkward and clumsy. There isn't enough time to fully unpack that shift and its political, cultural, and disciplinary sponsorship, but it's important to mention it because Paul was one of the few people that really put pressure on that project to evolve and challenged that kind of unbridled enthusiasm for digital exuberance that filled the first 12 years of the 21st century. So at that time, let's say 2011 to 2014, Paul and others used satire as a mechanism to upend the vices of heroic digital formalism and encourage a shift away from celebrating not the production value of architecture, but its content value. What do I mean by this? So the experimental architecture associated with the digital paradigm was often praised for the manner in which it aesthetically embodied labor-intensive digital routines rather than for its observable qualities and features, or for its cultural and social effects. The use of satire in the pursuit of the awkward and clumsy was a way to aggressively break from the exuberance of digital production. Now, more than a few years away from that break, and in an incredibly different political and social climate, architecture, I think in part because of the insistence on its evolution from Paul and others, is coincidentally more prepared to deal with the more pervasive and quotidian aspects of society. No longer accepting the pretentiousness and grandiosity affiliated with experimental architecture of the aughts, Paul's latest work embraces design for its ability to enliven the banal, the quotidian, and the casual. The 2 works that Paul will share with us tonight, the American Pavilion at the current Venice Biennale and his book, Kind of Boring, ask for more from architects and designers. So in the Pavilion, Paul and his collaborator, Paul Anderson, assess the status of wood-framed construction in architectural culture today. Beginning with the acknowledgement that wood framing is absent in intellectual discourse, Paul and Paul interrogate the, quote, sublime and aesthetic power, unquote, of this accessible, egalitarian, and pragmatic building system present in 90% of new homes constructed in the US. In the book, and in part with an intention to upend the classist tilt to formal practice, Paul, quote, presents an alternative to contemporary architecture through work which embraces normalcy and weird deviations from such, making a kind of architecture which explores basic form, anonymous history, and the effects of indifference and inattention to make the normal weird, end quote. Paul, welcome back to Syracuse.
Is this working now? Perfect. Kyle, thank you for an overly generous and entirely correct introduction. But nobody should go and watch, should have to suffer past brilliant lectures. So, I'm Paul Preissner. I'm really happy to be here. Still a bit taken aback by the introduction, which was probably better than the work you're going to see. So don't be too disappointed. I'm going to talk about two things. The first is probably what's most interesting, which is the US Pavilion presentation at the Venice Biennale of Architecture this year, open until November 21st. It's titled American Framing, which is both a metaphor and a kind of fact of being, in a sense. It's a title. I guess the kind of quick history, because I think our presentation, meaning Paul Anderson and myself, the co-commissioner and co-curators of this, thought about this project and this kind of exhibition as not just a production of interest at a certain topic, but as a way to maybe even kind of reflect on the entire endeavor of exhibiting architecture at a kind of institution like Biennale, La Biennale, which is this kind of like big thing, started in the late 19th century in Venice as an art fair, an international art fair in the Giardini in the early 20th century. Belgium built a little house and started kind of exhibiting national work there. Over the next 30 years, a number of other nations did. In 1930, the Grand Central Art Galleries in New York wanted to do that too, so they bought a little piece of land, which I think there was something else there at the time, knocked it down and had Delano and Aldrich produce this kind of aspirational work of architecture, which perfectly maybe encapsulates the kind of insecurity of American cultural practice in the early 20th century, looking to Europe for ideas of taste and what is good. So they made this kind of pretty tacky Palladian, Neo-Palladian type pavilion in the Giardini itself. What we thought we would do was use this as a kind of moment within architecture to maybe explore American architecture, of which this is not, but typically or traditionally, I think, the US Pavilion in specific, but pavilions in general for architecture as a kind of immature exhibition world tend to take on a kind of larger global international topic and show like what they're interested in or what's kind of hot at the time. We thought it would be a kind of interesting moment and maybe ironic to actually do a real show of American architecture. And we were both kind of working on projects at the time. We have maintained kind of separate practices, his in Denver, Colorado, mine in Chicago. We had each of us had a kind of house in construction made in the most normal way of wood framing. And it seemed to us kind of fascinating, like super messy, really sloppy, almost, without needing any drawings to produce it, and it like goes up in a week or so. We thought it would be kind of interesting to make that the focus of the show, this kind of like construction type that is uniquely American and kind of embodies the same ethos of most of American cultural practice, whether it's art or comedy or music, something that seems kind of bored with tradition, open to lack of skill, not concerned about poor quality of materials or workmanship, and is more kind of privileging of expediency over quality, in a sense. And so we had this kind of clever idea to pitch the house. So, wood framing in America started in the kind of early 19th century. It came as the kind of outcrop of a wash of immigrants coming in from Scandinavia and Northern Europe, bringing with them their traditions in heavy timber construction or stone or masonry work, all things that required thorough education in the type, large, heavy horses and stuff to help build it, and it wasn't cheap. At the time, America was kind of experiencing a population growth, and also had this weird moral belief that they could expand infinitely to the west as long as you put a house anywhere. And so a number of people kind of within the Midwest, and it's really difficult to kind of isolate this down to a particular project or a moment, even though we do and I will, came up with a new form of construction, which at the time maybe disgusted some. No one had any kind of belief in the reliability of it, but it took advantage of things that was plentiful in America at the time. Douglas fir, the kind of tree that built America, unlike hardwoods, which grow slow and are really good quality materials. Softwood grows fast, it splinters, it really holds moisture, so it warps, it's kind of crummy. You wouldn't use it for furniture, and no one used it for buildings, but we had a lot of it. We also had a lot of people who didn't know how to build things. And so the idea kind of came, in multiple places in the Midwest, Kansas City, Iowa, Chicago, Indiana, but this idea that if you didn't have good enough wood to make 4 columns and some posts, and you didn't have the money to make an entire wall of masonry, you could make an entire wall of really terrible columns of crummy wood as this kind of wood-framed construction. And you could do it with just nails and a hammer without needing lots of people. There was plenty of wood around. It was also very easy to mill. And you could take it with you as you went to your farmstead in Nebraska and so on and build it yourself. And so American framing kind of emerged in the early 19th century, 1828, 1830. There's a variety of different dates. Every time we seemed to have found one particular project, we would then, through research studios and seminars we conducted at the university, we would have students come to us and find some evidence of some other house built in Kansas City like 2 weeks before because the register said it was a wood-framed house. Wood also burns. It's not all great. And we lost Chicago as a result. But they put some coffee shops up. The kind of ease or quickness or the kind of like frivolity with which these things can produce started producing different novelties. Houses kind of went up easy and everywhere. Today it still accounts for over 90% of domestic construction throughout the United States, simultaneously existing almost nowhere in the rest of the world, because everyone else had their traditions kind of at the time. Nails. It ended up coming up with even cheaper forms of innovation in a way, like to take the kind of worst wood that you could think of, to find a way to build a house with it, and then to take the waste product of that type of wood and make a sheathing out of it, OSB, this kind of abstraction of an abstraction in a way, kind of developed as well. And this brings us to Venice and what our kind of idea was for this. So that little yellow bar is the front of the US Pavilion in the Giardini, which is one of the only public parks in Venice with trees. It's a nice place. Here's the pavilion itself. It's basically a rotunda with the main entrance, which subsequently, is no longer the main entrance. And then these 2 wings producing 4 galleries and a rotunda gallery and this kind of exposed courtyard to one of the main axes in the Giardini. We had this idea to take kind of America's idea of what quality architecture was in the 1930s, this kind of aspirationalism, this neo-Palladianism, and complete it with the kind of dumbest form of American build, the wood-framed house, and to kind of explore all the details in a kind of profane sense of proportions. So you would have dormers. Here it actually is just prior to opening. As you approach the pavilion, it's a kind of way to communicate all that's at stake, all that's inside with just the effect of the performance of architecture itself. It has dormers, it has a front porch, it has a front entrance, it has an attic that you can store sweaters in if you want. It has a foundation. One of the things that I think for us has always been problematic within the exhibition of architecture is that it's always done so poorly in general. It's always more or less like you're reviewing a book on a wall in a space, either too much information or the things you want to see are unfortunately only representations of what you actually want to see. Unlike, say, art where you see the painting that's being exhibited, in architecture you typically see the photograph of the building you care about or more text than you want to read while you're on your feet. What we did is to kind of actually produce the architecture itself as the exhibition of itself. This is not so much an installation for us in a kind of creative sense, but it's a literal addition to the building. It kind of produces a new courtyard. It kind of completes the cultural arc of the United States. It sits nicely with the trees that it comes from. It's blonde, I guess, kind of American. And there's a number of different parts to the show. So this is the kind of like advertisement for what it is without needing any kind of title. It's explicit. And then within we have a set of furnitures. Oh, but before we get to the furnitures, side entrances, side doors. The other side door. It's the front. It kind of like weirdly sits nice with the Sverfen Nordic Pavilion. Like you have the concrete rhythm and then the, you know, like what proper architecture is, like done perfectly. I always felt bad for any of the nations that have to exhibit in like the one true work of art in the Giardini, because no one goes to see their show. They just go to see the Sverfen Pavilion. But we did the kind of knockoff version in cheap wood with nails. So, but the idea is you kind of enter within the installation, within the addition itself, are a set of furnitures. These were done by a practice called Carrie Norman, partnered by Carrie Norman and Thomas Kelly. Thomas Kelly is a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. What we asked them to do was to kind of explore domestic furnitures that we could use to populate the structure, this kind of house itself, to give a sense of scale and occupation and really understand each floor for what it is. They referenced shaker furnitures, but instead of using quality furniture hardwood, they used really cheap spruce and nails to produce a set of kind of shaky, ill-advisable chairs or benches, or a rocking chair because of that doesn't rock, but you sit in a kind of permanent rocked position. So there's a bench. This is just kind of ascending the heights. And then you go kind of into the gallery spaces itself. Within the galleries, we have two sets of work. One is a series of models, and it's through the models that you actually begin to understand and appreciate the entire history and the lineage of wood framing. There's really no text. There's very little text within the pavilion itself. There's no historic photographs. There's no kind of archival references of things that happened. All there are in each of the 5 rooms, a series of models in the table in the middle, surrounded by photographic artwork produced by Chris Strong of Chicago in a few galleries and Daniel Shea of Long Island and an MFA graduate of UIC in the other galleries. These things always work together and kind of organized in this processional nature where the very first galleries you get to follow on what you process through as you enter the pavilion itself, something kind of utterly familiar, the kind of domesticity that even if you're not discreetly aware of, you kind of understand as the skeleton that goes under houses. Today, the models in the room, in this first room is a Sears model house that was part of their catalog project, and then this kind of earlier version that I'll show in a little more detail later by a person named Solon Robinson, and surrounded by work by Chris Strong that kind of explores the messiness of the construction site, the kind of detritus of the build, the temporary nature of all artifacts of construction to hold the thing up until it's up. One of the reasons wood framing was so ridiculed at the beginning is because it literally is quite as flimsy as you would imagine, but somehow, once everything's together, it maintains a kind of rigidity itself. But in the individual moments, no wall stands alone and needs all these kind of janky, diagonal, temporary bracings to hold things in place. There's a kind of funny story that we uncovered where, I guess in Indiana, there was a massive windstorm. One of the houses was uplifted off its foundations and rolled down the hill, but stayed intact. And it gave the people confidence about wood framing, but not about foundations, I guess. As you kind of process through the galleries, the second gallery that you see starts to go from the familiar, the kind of artifact of architecture itself, and goes into the social aspects, the kind of people that build these things, the kind of labor behind the work, the social aspects of labor, the different kind of classes of labor that exist, the professionalized labor, the precarious labor, the home builders, and that's kind of partnered with more social housing in a particular sense through. This is in the middle. It's a little doghouse. And then the last two galleries is where things start to get a bit vaguer, where you go from the familiar to maybe the more mythical or mysterious, where Daniel Shea was kind of tasked with exploring, let's say, the origins of the forest, the kind of myths of the wood, the kind of rumors of material, the fauna and flora of the places these come from, social aspects of labor and the tools itself. And they're kind of partnered with models that are somewhat more idiosyncratic or weird or horrific. In this one particular room, there's three. You can see the kind of A-frame model, which was taken from government documents for the Department of Forestry or agriculture from the 70s, where they produced a set of plans that people could use for vacation homes in Wisconsin. In the middle is this kind of building type called the blockhouse, which was designed by the US Army during the slaughter of the American Indians that they used as these outposts to put across the plains, North Dakota, Nebraska, to give them a perfect 360 view to shoot the indigenous population without getting arrowed themselves. But then partnered more optimistically with this little irregular geodesic dome structure from Colorado, and we'll kind of look at that in more specifics later. And then you kind of finish the galleries with maybe the most ghostly of projects, this warehouse by George Washington Snow, and I'll kind of explain the details of that later. But the models themselves in specific are where you track the history. They're built quite accurately and thought of more as miniatures than models. They're not representational, they're actual. This was a project or a set of projects. There was a businessman in Indiana who was writing in a lot of the journals at the time and came up with this thing called a cheap farmhouse. And it was quite cheap. And what he did, and this was in 1837, 1840, he basically put over a couple of pages a small little plan and then an itemized list of everything you would need, 72 2x4s of 8-foot length, 72 2x6s of 10-foot length, 730 nails, basically everything you needed to produce the house in parts. And you could start with the smallest thing, and as you got more money or more land, you could eventually add it to the full house and produce a porch. The kind of proto version of the Sears model home that came in the early part of the 20th century, where they would actually just deliver all the parts instead of tell you what needed to be done. This was the project that's kind of in the second galleries, or one of the two, and it was a set of worker cottages or refugee cottages for survivors of the San Francisco earthquake in the early part of the 20th century. There was a company with the US government commissioned to build these houses that could be carted into these little villages. People lived in them. And then as things got resolved, they either destroyed them or some people just moved them to other parts of the city. And there's a kind of effort underway to identify the remaining refugee cottages. They have to kind of remove all of the exterior materials because they've been clad with normal things, but they found 80 of them or so. This is a project called Car Top Dome. it was in this kind of utopic hippie community in Colorado, and it was basically developed by these kind of utter amateurs who know nothing about how to build, but had this vague idea of what Buckminster Fuller was doing, but also no access to real materials. So they would kind of construct these things with a kind of like some idea of what proper geometry is, and also with parts that they found from dumps and stuff like that, producing this like community of these really weird, colorful bubbles. And then the kind of like ultimate project is this warehouse by George Washington Snow. This was a project that is often credited as the first built wood frame structure in the world. It's credited as such because Siegfried Gideon in Space, Time, and Architecture identified it as such, with basically one sentence saying the first wood frame structure in the world was built by George Washington Snow in Chicago in 1833. And then in the footnotes, like on the same page, kind of says that might not be true. Like, not even really sure where he got that information, but ever since then it's kind of been understood as fact. There's no photographs of it, there's no drawings of it, it doesn't really show up in any kind of city record, but students kind of underwent a forensic project on it and found where it existed in the city, kind of near Monroe Street or Madison Street and Michigan Avenue. At the time that Michigan Avenue was a river, George Washington Snow was a lumberman, kind of businessman, who had a lumber store. So he had this warehouse to sell things. We kind of figured out what the site lot dimensions were using like the very earliest ways balloon frames were built and the kind of shapes of warehouses and the kind of like, I don't know, ideas of architecture from heavy timber. We kind of came up with this. So you kind of start with what's familiar, you kind of end with what might not even exist, but is believed to be historic fact in the same text that it's denied as historic fact. In the middle, between the two galleries, and the rotunda by itself, sits this house. This is a doghouse. This is Spike's doghouse from Tom and Jerry. Spike loved this house. It's kind of where, you know, he would build it, he would find peace. It was continually destroyed by a cat and a mouse, and it was the kind of subject of many narratives. We had also uncovered blueprints for this house, so we were able to build a factual scale version of it. The drawings were at 1 inch to 1. So, like, it's literally what it is. It's really great. But this is in here for a couple reasons. And there's a slide that I keep meaning to uncover because it's just on my phone. But during the opening of all of this in May, there's always security. There's always, like, you know, in Europe, the police look more militarized somehow than our militarized police. But the US Pavilion is just to the north of the Israeli Pavilion, and in May, Israel was, you know, doing the thing they do. So there was a real heightened security presence, and we had bomb-sniffing dogs that came through the US Pavilion every single morning. And there's this kind of like moment where the dog was sitting down, the bomb-sniffing dog with a vest that said Polizei, looking at this house. And I kind of like that. Anyhow, this is in here because I think it plays a crucial role. And one of the things that was so interesting to us about wood framing and American framing is its utter ubiquity. The fact that it's so entirely unspecial and stupid and kind of unregarded that it's effectively invisible as anything of importance. And the kind of paradoxical role of that is that its ubiquity and invisibility has made it to be something that gets so subsumed into cultural practices itself that it becomes part of the narrative structure of how we tell stories about America, whether it's reflected back on by artists exploring the kind of absurdity of the geometry of the 2x4, whether it's by performance artists like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, one of the professional wrestlers from the 80s and 90s, taking on the lumber itself as a kind of like emblem of a gritty American masculinity or something. Richard Scarry using it as a way that you can actually both identify the program of a house and the idea of a house without having it all clad as a house so you can't see what's going in, basically x-raying things for itself. The stage setting for narratives like in the theater production of Oklahoma, being used at multiple levels in cartoons or comics like Gasoline Alley, where the construction of the frame of the house across multiple frames of the comic strip itself kind of tells the story about self-identification or kind of finding oneself in a way. Tom of Finland came over and was living in Los Angeles and hanging out with cops and was just utterly enamored by the masculinity of the lumberman, using it as a kind of way to identify, what male is, in a sense. The Wizard of Oz. It was really important. The house was small. For the lumber to build it, had to be carried by wagon many miles. All of those things, the kind of fact that like in E.T., the movie by Spielberg, the ultimate or the kind of climactic scene where Elliot is carrying E.T. in the BMX bicycle basket, evading the federal agents. They had to cycle through this kind of tract housing in development, all the skeletal, nature of wood frame construction. So it like produced the perfect kind of foil for the state of culture at the time, or the kind of instruments of production being used as kind of instruments of terror, like in movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Carpenter or other types of horror films. The two sets of photographs we have in some more detail so you can see a little bit bigger. The first is from Chris Strong, a commercial photographer in Chicago, and he spent, ended up like over a year because we had extra time, photographing houses across the United States, construction sites, factory builds, kind of documenting the flimsiness or the kind of messiness or temporariality of the interiors during construction, the kind of darkness of the wood, the kind of context of the neighborhoods as homes are being constructed. This was a rebuild destroyed in California wildfires, but he also started looking at the kind of people behind the things. In this particular case, you get this kind of Amish factory build company that made prefabricated wood-framed walls and structures and roof trusses. They were apparently really easy to work with because Chris brought all of them ice cream on the first day, and this was them eating ice cream. And that seems to work really well. So bring ice cream to your jobs. People building houses, regular people. This is the boss. But he also looked at the kind of like precarious labor that goes into a lot of this. There's around 100 to 300,000 people that stand in Home Depots or Big Lots or Lowe's and are picked up and work for $20 a week to basically build all the framed houses in the United States, to kind of understand the class of labor and the kind of categories of people that actually go and produce this, and the kind of social lives that actually surround and orbit that, down to the kind of individual homeowner who, because it's ubiquity and the fact that you grow up with wood framing, you almost inherently know how to do it without needing to know how to do it. And again, the kind of lack of details necessary and the kind of repetition, as long as you put a stud next to 20 of them, like the wall will stay up. Daniel Shea is an artist in Long Island City, and he kind of was asked to look at something a bit more vague and maybe kind of mysterious, and to kind of explore the natures of the forest, the kind of textures of the flora, the kind of identities of the fauna that live there. These pictures come from lots of different places and could come from any of them. So the kind of specific woods that they're from was actually not just unimportant, but important that it's unidentifiable in a particular way, or the kind of aspects of the construction site or the social aspects of labor, the details of the wood. This is just a close-up of the one kind of mysterious flattened wood thing. So in the final gallery, after you've kind of sequenced through the non-chronological history but categorized through the idea of what you know to what you can't know. Then you enter the final gallery and then kind of re-enter into the courtyard itself. The backs of Daniel's work were kind of framed to look like double-hung windows, so you get this kind of almost Rachel White-Reed kind of positive of the kind of typically negative space within the house. But you enter this courtyard, which almost the kind of opposite of your entry, where you saw the dormers, you saw the porch, you kind of understood everything as a house, even if it didn't look like any house you've ever seen. You enter this courtyard, which is now just a kind of abstraction of the wood frame itself, with this 4-story shear wall structure and populated by a little more abstract benches by Polish-American architect Anu Jaworska, also from UIC, that kind of have a direct relationship with the neoclassical columns of the Palladian-esque villa gallery itself. The courtyard is typically exposed and now ends up kind of being protected and enclosed by the abstraction of the shear wall itself into this kind of new form of social space or kind of conceptual space within the work. All of which allows you to kind of understand the topic without ever needing to be told the topic or explained it. You can either understand it or misunderstand it, but you kind of know it. That is the first part. So that's the US Pavilion. It's up until November 21st. You're all welcome. There is a BYOB party on Sunday, November 21st. Right there. What I wanted to talk about next, and I'll do this a bit more briefly, I guess, or kind of breeze through this, is really to kind of contextualize where work like that comes from, and maybe to kind of build on a further examination of just what it is I'm even doing, that Kyle generously kind of explained at the beginning. This is Garfield and Odie, and I forget the other two cats' names. But anyway, this is a comic by Jim Davis. My book is called Kind of Boring: Canonical Works and Other Visible Things Meant to Be Understood as Architecture, or meant to be seen as architecture. It begins to explore a kind of notion of boringness and kind of dumbness within architecture as a way to kind of produce a conceptual space between you and the work itself. It came from kind of an assessment of culture in general that I had, or maybe a displeasure that I had with these kind of fanciful, interesting works that demanded an enormous amount of attention from you and needed you to either like it or not like it. And to me, it seemed that you should have no need for an opinion of the work at all, for it to have meaning. This isn't explicitly about this, but this is a funny comic. So this is Garfield by Jim Davis. It's this horrible cartoon strip that ran and still runs. A kind of weird anecdote is at some point I saw an interview with Jim Davis in the 80s, and they asked him to like draw Garfield, and it had been like machine shopped out to some animation studio for so long that like he didn't even know how to draw his own cat anymore. But the premise is it's basically this depressed cat who harasses this dog and overeats and doesn't like the first day of the week. Endlessly. Every single day in the newspapers for decades. And it's horrible. But something interesting started to happen is there is a Scottish artist who made something called Real Cat Garfield. And he went through decades of strips and replaced every Garfield with just a drawing of an actual cat to kind of like introduce the absurdity of the entire endeavor of the strip as it was, or in a way to kind of like, to kind of misunderstand this dumb thing of art and the kind of provocation of the real world. And then what happened after, and maybe this ended up being even a little bit, and this is just great, like the cat does what a cat does. It just looks at him, sometimes the food, but utterly indifferent to the human. There is something done called Garfield Minus, where somebody did the same thing, except instead of replacing Garfield with a real cat, just erased Garfield from every single strip and you get maybe the most profound like view on contemporary like psychology of an American male that you might have in a long time. And they're really great. And that, in a way, was maybe a kind of provocation to produce a book on what architecture is in a kind of context, as opposed to thinking of it as a kind of individual thing anymore. So there's some essays in the book. The layouts look like this. It was designed by a wonderful man named Joe Gilmore, who's in England. But now I just have a series of kind of Flannery O'Connor-like slides as we go through, and we can kind of look at work. I think the basic idea is the fact that in the world we live in the kind of mediated form of architecture, that it's always something that can be thought of more as a kind of contextual artifact instead of something there itself. It's not there in the sense that a performative work of architecture like Bilbao is done in a way to kind of produce such a strong effect that you need a reaction, that you actually produce a kind of meaning of the work through your relationship to it. For me, it seems the whole point of boring architecture is that it's actually not performing for your attention in any way. What's attractive about it is that it simply doesn't exist. And it has a meaning entirely independent of our relationship to it, and actually requires that we don't have a relationship to it at all. The boringness of architecture actually produces a space between us and the work that kind of allows for reflection. I think in culture, what I've found through the images is there's a lot of like really wonderful things, and this might be one of them. You can see it's a figure drawing art class. There's the artist. There's the one art student who is embarrassed to be there, refusing to draw, shaking its head. There's the other person who's just doing their best, and drawing in motion, you know what's happening. But you see this kind of thing throughout this explosion of imagery on the internet, which has kind of rendered the image in a way incomplete or unneeded. And you have this sense of like what is loneliness, or kind of what the first meaning of aloneness is, or what blankness is, or what the role of architecture might be, or how things can actually work when they're situated as a way to produce space or to kind of leave us alone instead of attract one's attention to it. Sometimes the things I see are more fascinating when they're in this kind of sloppy, incomplete sense. This is not from the American Framing Project, but was something that I'd seen well before it. Some of these are just worth explaining. When I was a kid, this was the kind of poster in the 80s that all boys were supposed to have in their room. It has all the cool cars. I guess it's in Malibu or something. I don't know, but like even questioning like what the idea of architecture is, or what space is or can be, where it kind of produces an absurdity that has its own autonomous identification to it. You know, rocks don't have any meaning, but in a building they do, and so does lunch or Harrison Ford. And so in the projects that I've started doing, like Dungeon, there are things that try and produce a work that requires nothing of you other than producing a space that incorporates a kind of idea of weirdness. Let's say, I think maybe where I would disagree with Kyle is it's not satirical work, but deeply cynical work, but in the most optimistic way. Like kind of, I think I'm a really optimistic cynic of the world. This is a project that we're working on in Muskegon Heights, Michigan, for an apartment building. Sad bathroom tiles, poor paintings. At some point, poor paintings started to have more feeling than high quality paintings, right? The idea where you start to see, and I kind of wonder what it is, and if it's me, but it ends up being something more deeply about the content than the technique, I think. Where the kind of content and the kind of meaning of the project is able to exceed the technique itself, and in a way actually requires the technique to be quite poor, so that the composition is what you pay attention to, not the kind of quality of representation. A lot of these are just funny slides. I mean, I think, like, what do you look at when you're doing work? And I think that has an influence on you that you need to kind of often be mindful of, and seek out even worse images and more, kind of more poor representations of people, or even great customizations of rental apartments, or sad moments in your kid's birthday party in 2013 when their ice cream fell, or great basements in Oak Park. I don't even know what this is. Like, it's really great. But similarly, like, the idea that a project then is about its composition and maybe the kind of content of idea, no longer the technique, and you could begin to produce a work where your technique is somehow so over-designed that the production of it in any quality sense is utterly unnecessary. Bill. And so you can have a stack of precast columns that have no relationship to the ones below them, other than they kind of somewhat need to be in the same place because everything's chunkier than it needs to be. So you can be sloppy and worry more about how tall it is than how precise it is, or kind of how absent it is. This was probably a great place to go in Sheffield at one point. The kind of tackiness of culture, the kind of sadness of office space. Like, I think the thing, I guess, for me in work is that it needs to begin to explore the other types of feelings that exist in the world, and not just things that are considered beautiful, but understanding that, like, maybe a kind of very miserable looking building actually produces more of a meaningful condition for one to exist in. This nobody's ever been able to explain, and in a way I show it at architecture lectures because we're all experts, and somebody should be able to tell me why would this be on the Murphy's Auto Parts wall? Is it for fire people? Maybe for firemen? Like, if it's on fire, use caution? I don't know. If any of you know, if there's any structural engineers in the house. This is an art gallery in Chicago. Fago, production of art, the kind of way space exists. This is the poor Canadians. Like, what's the Canadian form of architecture? It might be that. What's the most, like, lonely you can make a building where it actually starts to appear interesting again in a way? These are the kind of things I wonder about. Buy the book. I have 2 copies that I'll give to whoever asks quickest. That's it. So now we're supposed to go downstairs and drink a lot, and then we can ask argumentative questions to Mark Linder.